Good evening. My name is Catherine Babayan, and I am the director of the Armenian Studies program. I'd like to welcome you all to our annual Distinguished Berj Haidostyan Lecture. I'd like to welcome all of you. It's the first time that we're actually having our lecture on the 10th floor of the Weiser Hall. But I'd also like to welcome all of our visual audience because it's the first time that we're live streaming our lectures. So whoever's out there in cyberspace and not watching basketball, please, accept my welcome to this annual Berj Haidostyan lecture. The Dr. Berj Haidostyan Annual Distinguished Lecture was established by their family members of the late Dr. Berj Haidostyan, a prominent and devoted physician in our community, both at the University of Michigan and very active at the Armenian Studies program. Welcome. I thought Mrs. Alice Haidostyan would be here. She's always been a very loyal member of our community. I'm sorry that she's not here with us today, but she's here in spirit. But I'd like to personally welcome the extended family of the Haidostyans who established this lectureship in honor of Dr. Berj Haidostyan, Christine Gary, Michael Gary, Dikran Haidostyan. Special welcome and thanks for your support. I cannot help but remember one of the last times I think the Garys were coming from Chicago in 2014 during a blizzard. And I think Mrs. Alice Haidostyan, along with Dikran Haidostyan, insisted, although we thought we should cancel our lecture, insisted that we go on. Their steadfastness and commitment are really testimony to the ongoing lectureship that we have today, thanks to their support. Every year, we select from among internationally recognized experts on subjects Armenian, different scholars who we invite for the Haidostyan Distinguished Lecture. Recent Haidostyan Distinguished Lectures have included the maverick sociologist Taner Akçam, who has transformed the field of Armenian genocide studies. The film and visual theorist Mariot Baronian, that very year where we had the blizzard and the polar vortex, the playwright, novelist, and actor Eric Bogosian, and the director Atom Egoyan. Today, we're fortunate to have the international criminal lawyer Nicholas Koumjian to take us into the realm of law and the practice of international criminal justice, a nascent field in which he has been a beacon of hope. Thank you to the Haidostyan family for your support and for making this possible. This year as well, I would like to thank two of our supporters and co-sponsors, the Donia Human Rights Center, thank you Robert Donia, who's here in the audience, and the program in the International and Comparative Studies, thank you Rob Francese and Natasha Gruden-Alibegovic. I would also like to thank our ASP programmer, Naira Tumanyan, for all her work that has made this evening possible. I first encountered Nicholas Koumjian's work in a letter he wrote back in April of last year to the New York Times editors, where he responded to criticism of the Khmer Rouge trials, which went on for 11 years, cost $300 million, and convicted 3 criminals. As Koumjian laid out the magnitude of the task at hand, when a quarter of the population of Cambodia was killed and millions were forced into labor camps, the question remains, how does one begin to evaluate the trauma and violence against innocent human lives in terms of time and monetary costs. Koumjian pointed out the importance of precedent that the Khmer Rouge trials established. For the first time, 4,000 victims were civil parties to the trial that included charges of forced marriage and rape propagated by the Khmer Rouge, who had not only chosen spouses, but forced them to consummate their marriage. This degree of state control over its citizens and the forced conversions of, in this case, the Cham Muslims, Koumjian underscores this critical precedent for the judgment of current and future cases of rape, forced marriage, and forced conversions that we have witnessed, say, by ISIS on their Christian and Yazidi victims. For such atrocious acts to be held accountable by the genocide conventions as crimes against humanity, the Khmer Rouge trials were indispensable. A sine non quo that could potentially consider the struggle for recognition of people labeled as hidden Armenians, descendants of Armenians in the Ottoman Empire who were forced to give up their Christian religion as a crime against humanity. Nicholas Koumjian began his career as a deputy district attorney in Los Angeles. He then moved into the international arena, turning his focus from California to war-torn scenes around the world. Since the year 2000, he has been involved with international criminal law, prosecuting the worst crimes against humanity in our times. From his role as one of the prosecutors of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, where he charged the mayor of Prijedor, Milomir Stavic, with war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide, he headed the serious crimes unit in East Timor and a human rights program in Colombia. He was a senior appeals counsel for the prosecution of former Liberian President Charles Taylor at the Special Court for Sierra Leone, and most recently as the international co-prosecutor at the Khmer Rouge Tribunal. Koumjian completed final arguments in the trial of Neon Chao, brother number 2 in the Khmer Rouge regime, and Khio Samphan, the former head of state, on charges for crimes committed by Khmer Rouge during the democratic Kampuchea regime between 1975 and 1979. These experiences have convinced Koumjian that international justice has prevented atrocities. They could be more effectively prosecuted, and then therefore more people will be deterred in the future. But in his words, for those who suffered, there is a feeling of justice until there is a verdict. Today, he will discuss the future of international justice for war atrocities, its significance, and its cost. Please join me in welcoming Nicholas Koumjian.
Thank you very much, Catherine. I want to thank the Armenian Studies Program and the Haidosyan family for this invitation. It's really a pleasure and honor to be with you, especially considering the very prominent previous speakers that have given this lecture in the past. And I also want to thank all those here, especially the students that came to listen to this. I want to discuss, as Catherine said, the subject is, I want to focus on what can be done now and in the future in this field of international criminal law. But in order to do that, I think it's very important to review what has happened in the last quarter century or so, where this very embryonic field has started to develop. Anyone reading the newspapers this week, you would have heard news and followed news about ongoing conflict in Syria. You would have read about the Rohingya Muslims, where 90% of that population, about 700,000 people, have been forced from their homes and out of the country, out of Burma, out of Myanmar, into Bangladesh. They were forced because of attacks on villages, villages being burned, women being raped, individuals being massacred. And in Syria, to date, there's estimates are by the UN Special Representative that over 5 million people have moved out of Syria, have been displaced out of the country, 6 million displaced within the country, in other words, moved from their homes in Syria to another home. And the estimate, and these are obviously all they can be as estimates at this point, is that to date about 400,000 people have died in that Syrian conflict. So what can we do with such horrendous crimes ongoing now? It's also believed by many people that there are concentration camps in North Korea, very much like what the Khmer Rouge had, where 100,000 people or more are being held in conditions of enslavement. What can be done? Well, some people, you'll hear people say, well, they should go to the World Court. Unfortunately, there isn't a World Court. There is no such thing. There are various courts have been established, including the International Criminal Court, but each of these have limited jurisdiction. It's limited by the powers that were given to it by the sovereignty of states, what they've given up. Even the International Criminal Court, which I'll talk about in a little more detail later, it's based on treaty. So while many states have joined that court, I think now the number is 124 states are members of the International Criminal Court. The most powerful countries in the world and the most populous countries in the world are not members. The United States is not a member of the court and unlikely to join anytime soon. Russia is not a member of the court. China is not a member of the court. India, Pakistan are not members of the court. Israel and most of its opponents in the Middle East are not members of the court. Jordan is a rare exception and is a member of the court. So while there have been many calls to refer the Syrian situation to the International Criminal Court, I think Switzerland led a movement to have the Security Council refer that case to the ICC, which under the statute of the ICC that can be done. It was vetoed by Russia and China, and there's no prospect of that happening anytime in the near future. And these courts that are established, like the ICC, have limited powers. They don't have armies. They don't even have a police force. The ICC has no police. When it goes to investigate a case, it depends upon the state letting the investigators in. It depends upon states providing security for witnesses and those who are interviewed. And it obviously would depend upon states for arrests. There's no armed police from the ICC that can go out and arrest someone like President al-Bashir of Sudan, who's been indicted by the ICC for genocide. There's an arrest warrant out for him that includes the charge of genocide. But the ICC depends upon states to effectuate that arrest. Al-Bashir has been able to travel to other countries, including countries that are members of the court, such as South Africa, without being arrested. So these courts have limited powers. But I don't want to be so negative. Much has changed in the last quarter century. In 1992, when the war in Bosnia broke out, a very vicious conflict in the center of Europe, when journalists from the United Kingdom particularly went to this town, Prijedor, and saw these camps and put photographs on the front page of newspapers of men who appeared to be starving behind barbed wire, it caused a lot of attention in the, among capitals, among people around the world, and put pressure on powers to do something. Nobody wanted to intervene. At that time, the Yugoslav army, I believe, was the 4th largest in the world. There was no appetite for military conflict or military intervention. But what the Security Council did do, probably many people criticize it as, oh, this was just to satisfy their own conscience and pretend to do something to stop the violence, was in 1993 they established the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, under the powers of Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, which gives the Security Council the right to take action when international peace and security is threatened. And all member states of the United Nations are obligated then to cooperate in the orders, any Chapter 7 order. At the time that court was established, probably they were thinking, well, maybe we'll arrest a soldier for committing a massacre or for committing a rape, or maybe a captain or lieutenant would get arrested, someone like the equivalent of a William Calley from the My Lai massacre. But no one at that time could have imagined that that court would still be trying cases. There's still a trial ongoing at what's now called the mechanism, but really is the ICTY. So now it's 25 years later. It's still going on. But that court indicted 161 individuals. They weren't all just guards at camps or low-ranking soldiers or officers. The court took to trial, recently reached a judgment on Ratko Mladic, who was the top general of the Bosnian Serbs. One of the top generals of the Croatian forces, Gotovina, was tried. He was acquitted. Radovan Karadzic, the president of the Bosnian Serb entity, and even Milosevic was tried at the ICTY. No one would have imagined when that court was established in 1993 that it would reach persons of that level. And in the next year, 1994, the Security Council, again, undoubtedly too late, decided to take action about Rwanda. There was not an effective military intervention to stop the genocide in Rwanda, which occurred in about 100 days. But what the Security Council did do is it established a tribunal in Rwanda. And that court also has tried dozens and dozens of persons for various crimes, but including the crime of genocide in Rwanda. This court in the former Yugoslavia, the ICTY, it now has a database of evidence that consists of 9 million pages. There's 9 million pages of transcripts and evidence and witness statements at that court. For those, now, I worked at that court, and I remember the early years, there was, and I've heard other friends of mine who worked there say the same thing. There was a real feeling that we were changing the world. We were quite idealistic about it, that this was really important, that we were going to satisfy the victims' calls for justice. I think all of us now feel maybe a little bit jaded about that, maybe a little bit disappointed. We've seen, of course, conflicts are still ongoing. We haven't stopped war, obviously. Even among victims of the former Yugoslavia, many of them are less than satisfied with what the court did. But I still think it has had a tremendous effect, a very positive effect in terms of the jurisprudence and in providing victims some measure of satisfaction. For many of those who testified, it was very important to them to have an opportunity to explain what happened to them. The victims that I've met from Bosnia, the victims I met from Sierra Leone, from Cambodia, what they all had in common was a tremendous desire to see what happened to them recognized as a crime. It's hard for me even now sometimes to understand how strongly they feel about that. But, we can't bring back their loved ones. We can't reduce the torture that they suffered. We can't even give them any kind of money as compensation in these courts. It's simply impossible when millions are victims. But I find that consistently they feel a strong, fundamental, deep-seated desire to see the crime recognized. This did happen to them. It was wrong, and someone should be held responsible for it. So the first trial that I participated in was the mayor of this town of Prijedor. It was a town of about 50,000 people, and again, it was about 100 days after the municipality was first taken over. About 3,000, very close to 3,000 individuals were killed. Some camps were set up, including the infamous Omarska camp. The first witness, by the way, who testified in that trial is here with us tonight, and that's Robert Donia, who was called as the first witness to talk about the history of Bosnia, to provide a context to what happened during the conflict. I thought it might be just interesting for you to see just a little snippet of testimony, just so you see how, what it's like in those courts. So the testimony I'm about to play is from a young man called Samuel Poljak. At the time that he was put in the Omarska camp, he was 19 years old. When the municipality was attacked, he lived in the Kozarac, an area where the Bosnian Muslims were concentrated. His family started to flee towards the town where they thought it would be safer, but they didn't believe that it would be safe for him because he was 19, he was military age. So he tried to escape over the mountains and get out of Bosnia, but was captured and taken to the Omarska camp. And here, in this little bit of testimony, he's describing the first days of his detention when he was put into a garage. So just to play a minute or so of this first video, and you can see something about the testimony. Do we have the sound? Can you tell the judges what the conditions were like in that garage? Can we increase the sound a little?
It was just an ordinary garage, as far as I could notice, for cars to be kept in, and that's where they put us, all of us. There must have been around 150, 160 of us, or whereabouts, or thereabouts. So there was not enough room inside this garage for us to sit down. We were all standing from that moment on, like sardines, packed like sardines.
Days did you spend in that garage with the group of about 150 men?
Ja sam bio tu.
I spent about 10 days there. 10 days.
What was that like?
To je bilo strašno.
It was dreadful. When they shut us up, inside it was very hot. There wasn't enough air. I remember that within half an hour or 1 hour, I was soaking with sweat. Everything I was wearing, my shirt, my trousers, it was all soaked in sweat. It was unbearable. I remember that I pressed my hand against the wall, and I saw that the paint on the wall began to melt. The ceiling was full of drops of sweat. Sweat was dripping from the ceiling, and then someone asked to have the window opened. I think someone did, I have no idea, but I remember that someone jumped up and smashed a window in order to get some air inside the room, but that didn't improve the situation, because even after that it was very stuffy and very hot. We asked for water because we were parched, and they said, okay, we'll give you some water, but first you have to sing a song. So we sang at the top of our voices, and then the jerry can filled with water was brought to us, and then people started fighting over the jerry can. It was awful. It was a fight to survive, as simple as that. No one really cared about the person next to them. We fought like animals over the water they had brought us. It was really awful. I remember the first evening, 2 young men suffocated. I remember them very well. They were just lying there on the floor. They were dead. No one flicked an eye. No one paid any attention. That was the state we were in, and everyone just looked after himself. No one had any sympathy for the dead body lying there. Until a day ago, we were still talking. We had still talked to each other, and now this person was dead. But it made no difference. It was really awful.
So after those 10 days, Samar Polyak was released from the garage and taken to another room, and there he found his father, who had been arrested also. He didn't know that before, that he was at the camp. His father, though, was taken out and beaten to death and died at that camp. So I'll talk later about costs, but that court, the Yugoslav Tribunal, the ICTY, the cost of that has exceeded a little bit over $2 billion. The Rwanda Tribunal cost a bit less, but approaching $2 billion. There was a lot of feeling in the United Nations that these courts are too expensive, they take too long, so can there be another model? In 1999, the conflict was raging in Sierra Leone. I don't know if any of you ever saw the movie Blood Diamond, but it's a fairly accurate portrayal about some of the things that happened. Rebels were amputating hands of victims in order to spread terror. And the government of Sierra Leone, President Kaba, wrote a letter to the Secretary General of the United Nations asking for assistance to prosecute those responsible for the violence. Eventually, in 2002, by treaty between the United Nations and the government of Sierra Leone, a court was established, the Special Court for Sierra Leone. And it was established different from the ICTY and Rwanda, which were not in the countries where the crimes happened. The Yugoslav Tribunal was in The Hague, and the Rwandan Tribunal was in Tanzania. And that was done for reasons mainly of security of the court staff and the witnesses, that the trials were held in other locations. The Special Court for Sierra Leone was set up in Freetown in Sierra Leone. However, for the trial of Charles Taylor, when he was arrested in 2006, the former president of Liberia. The authorities in Liberia and Sierra Leone expressed concern for security if the trial was held in West Africa. So the trial was transferred to The Hague, and we conducted that trial again in The Hague for President Taylor. But in the Sierra Leone court is generally viewed now as a major success. That court cost about $300 million and indicted only 13 people. 4 of those died before they could be tried, but 9 went through trial. But that included the president of Liberia, Charles Taylor, the person that most people, most Sierra Leoneans believe was most responsible for the violence that happened in that country. The court also, I think a major credit to that court is it didn't just try rebels. They also put on trial leaders of government militias, the CDF, who were very popular in the country because they had defended the country against the rebels, but they had committed crimes. And leaders of the CDF were put on trial, and two of their top leaders were convicted and received substantial sentences. Charles Taylor was convicted, and this set a very important precedent. He was the first head of state, really, I believe, ever to be convicted in an International Criminal Tribunal. In the Second World War, of course, Hitler was dead before the court Nuremberg was established. Milosevic died before his trial finished. And in the Second World War, some people say Admiral Donetz, he was head of state in Germany for about 2 weeks after Hitler's suicide. He was convicted at Nuremberg, but not for anything that happened while he was, during those 2 weeks. He was convicted for the submarine attacks when he was the head of the Navy. So Taylor was really the first head of state ever convicted in a war crimes court. And it set some very important precedents. I remember one of the expert witnesses was Dr. Stephen Ellis, who was an expert on African politics. And he told me, outside of the courtroom, that even at that time when the trial was ongoing, he said there was a Taylor effect in that many people, many other observers of African politics had observed that there was, leaders were worried. They saw that Charles Taylor had been arrested and was on trial, and they were worried that if their forces committed similar crimes, they too could be held responsible. So there was a real deterrent effect. Also, Taylor's, many of his convictions were based upon aiding and abetting. And in the case of the Sierra Leone conflict, Taylor was convicted because the evidence showed he provided weapons, sent some men to support rebel forces that he knew were committing a campaign of atrocities, were committing crimes. And this was a very big legal issue at the time because a court at the ICTY, at the Yugoslav Tribunal, had said that in order to be guilty of aiding and abetting, the person had to intend the crimes, where they said that the aid had to be specifically directed to crimes. The Taylor judgment overturned that, said there was no authority in customary international law, and those who provide aid, even if you don't intend for crimes to happen, provide aid knowing the crimes are ongoing, knowing your aid will facilitate the crimes, could be held responsible. Now, at the end of the Obama administration, as many of you know, Saudi Arabia was involved in the conflict in Yemen, and there was bombings taking place, and a debate occurred between the Department of Defense and the Department of State about the aid that the United States was giving to Saudi Arabia. And members of the Department of State, according to the New York Times, had argued in that debate, look, we can't be providing this assistance because look at what happened in the Charles Taylor case. There the court said that those that provide assistance, knowing it's going to assist crimes, can be held responsible. We could be held responsible if we continue to provide this assistance with no conditions to Saudi Arabia. And Obama, for a time, suspended that assistance. It has since been reinstituted, but you do see in the way that conditions the United States has established concern about this, because the United States has asked part of that assistance required the Saudis to teach on human rights, to the various conditions about how they target. The U.S. provided Saudi Arabia with a list of sites that should not be bombed because they were religious sites, et cetera, civilian sites. So these cases can have a real effect on the conduct of states. I would argue that even the worst actors that you think couldn't possibly be affected by this, people like ISIS. I mean, ISIS, we know, has done horrendous, horrendous crimes. But I thought it's interesting when you think back on this horrible video that they released of when they burnt, trigger warning for any students about this. Of course, we're talking here about very horrible atrocities. But they captured a Jordanian pilot and they burned him to death. And they made a very slick, a very videographically well-designed video showing that execution. But the beginning of the video, they're trying to show the effects of coalition bombing on civilians in ISIS areas. So even ISIS is trying to win the hearts and minds of people by saying the other side is committing crimes. So we see that documenting who is responsible for crimes can affect it's something very much in the interests of parties to any conflict, and I believe it can affect the conduct of states. So in this special court for Sierra Leone, I talked a little bit about Samir Polyak, the man I showed you before. I remember talking to him after he testified, and he said he felt tremendously sense of satisfaction that he was able to tell his story to the court. The next little clip I'm going to show you is from the trial of Charles Taylor. And the man who's testifying, Mohammed Mansoureh, was an illiterate man who'd been captured by the rebels, and both of his hands were amputated. And subsequent to that, he also had a stroke, and he was in a wheelchair when he testified. The very last question I asked him during his direct testimony was to say, thank you for coming all the way from Africa here in your condition to testify. Can you tell us, why did you agree to come here? And this is his response.
Why I was willing to come and testify, it was for one reason. Because there was a man they used to call Charles Taylor. At the time there was war in Liberia, he said that war that had gone to Liberia would test the bitterness of that one in Sierra Leone. Everybody heard that in the radio. So if indeed the war came to Sierra Leone, and I am like this is my own portion of the bitterness that I tasted. Both of my hands were amputated. What he said was what came to pass. Those were his children who did that.
So try to imagine this. I mean, we showed here, I don't know, was there a picture of Charles Taylor right at the end? I might have turned my head. He's testifying, and as far away from him as Catherine is from me, is the president of Liberia. Here's an uneducated man whose life has been ruined, both of his hands amputated. And the man who he thinks was most responsible for that is there in the courtroom facing justice. It's a tremendously dramatic moment, and this happened repeatedly with the witnesses from Sierra Leone. Now, the court that I work at currently, the Extraordinary Chambers for the Courts of Cambodia, is likewise a court that was established through a treaty, in this case between the United Nations and the government of Cambodia. And the Khmer Rouge took power in 1975, so just weeks before the Vietnamese communists captured Saigon. The Khmer Rouge captured Phnom Penh. They ruled the country for 3 years, 8 months, and 20 days, a number that any Cambodian can tell you. And during that period of time, out of a population of about 8 million, estimates vary. Again, it's very difficult, but the best demographic studies that I've seen say that between 1.5 and 2.2 million people lost their lives. So close to a quarter of the population in less than 4 years lost their lives during that regime. Now, even after the Vietnamese invaded in '79 and installed a government, the civil war continued up until 1998. There still was fighting between not just the Khmer Rouge, but also anti-communist forces with the Vietnamese. And the conflict was even still ongoing when the two prime ministers at the time wrote a letter to the United Nations in 1996, 97, requesting that the United Nations help establish a court to try the leaders of the Khmer Rouge. Originally, UN experts said the court should be outside of Cambodia. The government of Cambodia insisted upon having the court in their country and also insisted on a great deal of control over the trial. So there were very difficult negotiations. The United Nations negotiators felt that this was a country with no tradition of rule of law, of judges making independent decisions, so was reluctant to put a UN stamp on a process that they were not sure could be independent and fair. Originally, the United Nations walked away from the negotiations, and then major powers said, you know, we want to see these trials, go back and negotiate. They went back, renegotiated, accepted the basic premise that there would be a majority of Cambodian judges in the trials in Cambodia, but with some provisions that no decisions could be made without a supermajority. So, for example, in the trial chamber, there are 5 judges. 3 are Cambodian and 2 are international. Any decision has to be by at least 4 out of 5. It's not just a majority, but requires a supermajority for any decision. So no one could be convicted without at least 4 out of the 5 judges voting for that. So this court was eventually established in 2006. It took about a year to just work out the rules. And since that time, so now we've been operating for over 10 years, only 3 individuals have been convicted. 2 of the top leaders, Q Sampan and Nun Chea, their trial, because they were elderly, the judges divided the charges, and we had one trial which was finished a few years ago where they were tried for the initial crimes of the regime, mainly for forcing everyone out of the cities. When they first took power, they emptied all of the cities. If you ever saw the movie Behind the Killing Fields, it depicts some of that. And people were forced into the countryside to work. But the second trial is the one that we're currently awaiting judgment on. And in this trial, they are charged with many more crimes, setting up these security centers where thousands were arrested and executed. There's a school in Phnom Penh, they called it S21. It was a high school. Records that have been recovered from the Khmer Rouge listing which prisoners were in which room, who was executed, who entered. In the last few years, we've closely analyzed and put all these various lists together. And according to our master list that we've now accumulated, 16,000 persons were executed at that high school in 3 years. 16,000. Many couples were forced to marry. The regime realized at one point that they were losing population and that they were likely to go to war. And these leaders, who were not always very realistic, but they decided they needed to grow the population. They were telling the population they wanted to double the population in 15 years, which is pretty much impossible. But they did that by telling young people that they had to marry, and they didn't have a choice. People were introduced to someone in one day and just assigned to that person to be married, often in mass ceremonies of dozens, even 100 couples at a time, and then told to go sleep together. So many of these people, quite a number, are still married. I mean, they still exist. And you can imagine, while this was a horrible, horrific experience, for some people, they survived it together. You can imagine if you're ever going to fall in love with someone, if you had to go through an experience like that together and survive together, some of them fell in love and they're still together. Some of them are still together just because they had kids and family, and divorce is frowned upon in Cambodia. And many, many broke up after, once the Khmer Rouge fell, they separated. But there are many children, many adults now, that are children of those forced marriages. Some know about that and some don't. It's a huge issue in the country that was hidden for many, many years until these trials really brought it out. Forced marriage is not one of the things covered, but there's a very good movie that was made, released last year by Angelina Jolie. I encourage any of you interested in Cambodia to watch it. It's called First They Killed My Father. It's on Netflix, I believe, but it's only in Khmer. It's subtitled in English. But it's a true story of one young girl and with experiences of her family during the Khmer Rouge regime. Also, as Catherine mentioned in the introduction, there are, I believe, very, very critical issues in this trial that we're awaiting judgment on as to the definition of genocide. And it's relevant both to what happened in 1915, and it's also very relevant to what's happening in places like Syria and Iraq by ISIS, to the Yazidis and to Christians. Because in our case, there are two charges of genocide. I think our case is a very good example of explaining the elements of genocide to lay audiences, and people often have misunderstandings. Because as I mentioned, about a quarter of the population died. The great, great majority of those who died, lost their lives, or were executed were Khmer, the majority ethnicity, Cambodian, Khmer ethnicity. But they weren't killed because they were Khmer. They were killed because their father was an officer in the old regime, their mother was a school teacher, or they were a teacher, or they were seen as bourgeois, or they picked up a piece of fruit that they weren't supposed to, and they were executed because of that. They were executed because they were politically distrusted. So they weren't, under the Genocide Convention, it has to be an act done with the intent to destroy a national, racial, religious, or ethnic group, to destroy them as such, in whole or part. And the law describes the in part as being the case as a substantial part that affects the remaining group. So we did not charge, and I have to explain this to Cambodian audiences, which sometimes they find it difficult to accept. We did not charge genocide of Cambodian people. The perpetrators themselves were Cambodian. Some of them said we should have charged genocide of urban people, because many of those people were distrusted because they were urban. They were from cities. But again, that's not a national, racial, religious, or ethnic group. What we did charge is 2 counts of genocide of much smaller groups. First, of the Vietnamese. The Vietnamese were, as the Khmer Rouge said, the hereditary enemy of the Cambodians. And it's definitely true that Vietnamese had a long history of being persecuted. Even under Sihanouk, under Lon Nol, there were massacres of Vietnamese. When the communists first took power, the Khmer Rouge, they sent most of their Vietnamese population to Vietnam. So when the policy changed in about 1977 to kill any that remained, there weren't that many left. So while our evidence is pretty clear that basically anyone who was Vietnamese was killed, even if you were half Vietnamese, you were killed, there weren't that many of them, and there aren't that many witnesses, because they did kill pretty much all of them. In fact, the evidence shows that quite a few witnesses say that in the cases of mixed families, because many of the Vietnamese who remained because they were married to a Khmer spouse. They said that if the mother was Khmer, and the father was Vietnamese, the children were generally left alone. But if the mother was Vietnamese, they killed the children also. One witness, they said, well, why was that? They said, well, they used to say, the children feed from the mother's breast. In other words, they had a matriarchal view of nationality, that you received your ethnicity or nationality from your mother. So they killed them. So the Vietnamese, it's simply a question of numbers. I think it's a clear case of genocide. We'll see what the judges say. The next group is a little more interesting for legal issues, because these are the Cham Muslims. Now, some estimates say that Cham Muslims, about 37 or 38%, Cham say much higher, but some of the scholars have estimated 38% of Cham were killed. So that's compared to 22% or so of Cambodian, Khmer people. It's not such a huge difference. But why do we say that the intent was to destroy that group? Because we look and we saw evidence at first. The first thing they tried to do, this is true of Buddhists also, they outlawed religion. But the Cham were Muslims, and religion formed a very important part of their identity. In a couple villages, when one village in particular, the Khmer Rouge were giving a lecture about how no more prayer, this and that, and one guy just stood up and started saying his prayers, and the whole village followed him. They rebelled with knives and swords. They fought against the Khmer Rouge, killed, I think, one of them, and then were massacred as the Khmer Rouge came in with guns, brought in outside forces. But once that happened in two villages, they were extremely distrusted. So there was a particular campaign in that area, which is the area where the Cham were concentrated, the area where they were existed in the highest numbers, and the area where that produced the religious scholars. And we have evidence from pretty high-level Khmer Rouge officials that are still alive who testified that the order was to kill all of them. And they made lists of all of the Cham Muslims in those villages, in those districts, and they killed all of them. They killed tens of thousands of Cham were killed in mass massacres. They particularly targeted the religious leaders. They targeted anyone who refused to give up their religion. So our argument, which we hope the trial chamber will accept, in some of the prior jurisprudence at the Yugoslav and Rwanda tribunals, the judges have said, well, genocide, destroy the group, means destroy physically and biologically. Well, we said, and that doesn't really make sense, that that's the only way to destroy a group. Genocide is a special crime to protect a group. You have other crimes like extermination covers the murder of a massive number of people. But genocide, you're not protecting individuals or even the number of individuals. You're protecting that group, that society, that the world benefits by groups surviving. And even by the terms of the Genocide Convention, which provide for 5 different kinds of acts that can constitute genocide. One is killing members of the group, plain enough. But others are creating conditions of life that could destroy the group. That's clear enough. But others are inflicting severe physical or mental harm and preventing births in the group. And lastly, transferring children from the group. Well, if you transfer children, you don't kill anyone. But if you took a small ethnic group, if you took the Armenians of Michigan and you transferred each of those Armenian children to a American non-Armenian family, if you took a tribe of indigenous Americans and you transferred all of their children out of the reservation or their homes with their parents to other families, what happened in 1915? Many children were taken from Armenian homes and transferred to Kurdish homes or Turkish homes and raised without knowing their identity, and of course very likely to intermarry. You can destroy the group in that sense, even if the DNA is still there. But physically or biologically, you could say the group exists, but the group is destroyed. And so this is a very important issue in how genocide is defined, because we say those words, destroy the group as such. Well, how do you destroy a religious group as such? If everyone who practiced that religion still lives, but they don't practice the religion out of fear of death, the religion no longer exists. It doesn't exist as such. The individuals may exist, but the group does not. So I think it's a very critical issue in international law that I hope will correct some prior jurisprudence that didn't really deal with it that way, because the genocides in Bosnia and Srebrenica or in Rwanda were very different, where they simply were trying to kill all Tutsis or kill all the men of Srebrenica. So it's a very important issue in international law. So I want to talk a little bit about the ICC. I've mentioned it already. Many people are disappointed with the results. The court has existed since 2002, the same year that the Special Court for Sierra Leone started, and it has fewer convictions than the Special Court for Sierra Leone. Sierra Leone, there were 8 convictions. All 8 who survived the trial were convicted. But the ICC to date, not counting contempt cases, there have only been 3 trial convictions and 1 guilty plea since 2002, so in 15 years. It's not a very impressive record. But it's important to understand how difficult the job of the ICC is. They're dealing with situations, crimes in 7 different areas of the world, 7 different countries. Again, as I said before, they have no police force. One of the reasons the Yugoslav tribunal was so successful was that you had NATO occupying Bosnia when the court was beginning its operations. NATO forces could effectuate an arrest. They could carry out a search warrant. So it was possible, you had power to carry that out. You don't have that many times in the ICC. There was a complete failure when they indicted people for the violence in the Kenyan elections. 2 of the people that they indicted were subsequently elected president and vice president, Kenyatta and Ruto of Kenya. Those cases fell apart. The prosecution says, and I don't know the evidence so well to know if this is true, but the prosecution says because of lack of cooperation by the government of Kenya and intimidation of witnesses. So you're always going to find the ICC. It's not a simple solution to just say refer it to the ICC and they'll prosecute the bad guys. The ICC depends upon state cooperation. It still matters who has the guns, who can protect the witnesses, who can make the arrests. We'll always be limited in that way. I've mentioned the costs of the ICTY and ICTR, that Sierra Leone and Cambodia are both around the $300 million figure, ICTY and ICTR around $2 billion. It sounds like an awful lot of money, and clearly it is. You can do a lot of good with $2 billion, $300 million. But justice is difficult. In these cases where you're trying to show how in Charles Taylor, for example, is responsible for Mohammed Mansour's hands being cut off. Charles Taylor never met Mohammed Mansour. He never met the guy that cut off his hands. He's probably never been into the village where that happened. So why is he responsible? It takes a lot of painstaking evidence in order to establish that there was this policy, he understood what was happening, that there was a campaign of atrocities, that he knew about the violence that was occurring, and he continued to provide the assistance. The linkage between the principal, whether it's Nunchea or Charles Taylor, and the crime, it takes a lot of evidence to establish that. And these are massive crimes. If you look at what happened at the Oklahoma City bombing, Timothy McVeigh, remember, he blew up the federal building in Oklahoma. How much money, that was a crime that occurred in one place in one day. How much money do you think that trial cost? Just one crime, one day, one incident. Well, according to what the FBI later, Department of Justice later information they released, it cost $100 million. $100 million, and that actually isn't including his appeal. I don't know how much his appeal cost, but considering it was a death penalty, it probably was very expensive. So, justice is not cheap. It can be expensive. $2 billion is a lot of money, but it's a lot, half the price of an aircraft carrier, of one aircraft carrier. Also, any military intervention is tremendously expensive. Even when the U.S. puts soldiers in Afghanistan, the estimate is the cost is $1 million per soldier per year. So, as I mentioned, the United States is not a member of the International Criminal Court. We've had a very complicated relationship with the court. I think there are some reasons why the United States would not join. First, we're involved in conflicts often around the world, like most other states are not. A country like, when there's chemical weapons dropped in Syria, people are not saying, where's the Dutch army? Why don't the Dutch do something about this? Or the Spanish, they're saying, why doesn't the United States do something about it? But on the other hand, it's a bit, and the United States can say, well, we don't want, foreign judges deciding if our Secretary of Defense or our general has committed a crime. You could say the same thing to Liberians about Charles Taylor, to Cambodians about Nunchea. At some point, if you're going to preach, you have to act. You can't say other people should agree to this, but we exempt ourselves. So it's my hope that in the long term, if the International Criminal Court proves its reasonableness, that the United States will eventually join the court. And certainly we've seen an evolution where when the court was first established, the U.S. took very affirmative steps against the court. The United States even passed a law, the American Service Members Protection Act, that basically said that the U.S. president could use all means to liberate any American arrested by the court. Critics called it the Hague Invasion Act. And the United States originally under Bush started making agreements called Article 98 agreements with various countries that's saying, if you want us to assist your military, continue to give you money, you have to sign something promising you will never cooperate with any attempt to arrest an American serviceman by the court. But, the U.S. hostility, perhaps in the beginning to the court, changed. And to his credit, George W. Bush, when the Darfur situation was ongoing, Colin Powell called it a genocide. And the United States agreed, that the Security Council would refer that case to the International Criminal Court. The United States could have vetoed it, but instead abstained from that vote and supported, basically, the referral of that case to the International Criminal Court. When the Libyan conflict was ongoing, the United States actually voted in favor of referring the Libyan conflict to the International Criminal Court. So we've seen some evolution. Now, that may be challenged in the near future because the prosecutor announced recently, fairly recently, that she was asking the judges to give her permission to investigate the situation in Afghanistan, and that would include instances of torture by American forces of Afghan detainees. That will definitely complicate the United States' relationship with the International Criminal Court. Are the courts worth it? I think there are many, many benefits. I've talked about the precedent of the law, how it can deter countries, deter individuals, and deter countries from policies that could be criminal. But I also think one of the most important benefits of this kind of justice is for the victims, first, they themselves feel that feeling of satisfaction to see that their crime is recognized. But secondly, it makes people who've gone through these conflicts believe that the world is a more just place. If you go through life believing that evil actors get away with it, that, evil can triumph, it makes you very cynical about many things. And I think it can change individuals and whole societies' view about life, that good can triumph, and that affects our own behavior. If we believe that evil is always rewarded, it's obviously not it's an incentive for people not to act well. While if you believe that in the end evil will be punished, it makes people believe that there is a reason to be good and to hope for good in the world. I'd just like to play one of the witnesses who testified in the first trial of Nunche and Kusampan. Her name is Cheng Eng Lee. About her, at the end of her testimony, she was a civil party. One of the unique aspects of the Cambodian court is that victims actually can participate as parties. So they're represented by one lawyer. And when a civil party testifies, at the end, the judges give them a chance to just tell the court what they hope to get out of the trial. So this is her testimony.
When we were leaving Phnom Penh and we were traveling along National Road number 1, crossing Munibung Bridge, I saw a crying baby. He was actually crawling over the dead body of his mom. I wanted to carry that baby. I wanted to take the baby. From the time when I wanted to carry the baby, and the soldier carried this baby was so brief that I could not actually do anything. But of all of a sudden, when the soldier carried this baby, they just tore the baby apart. It was a very horrifying scene. I could not imagine any human being who would do that.
I'm sorry, actually I played the wrong video, but this is a horrible experience of what happened to this woman. I should have played Tuch Pandarase. If you could play that now, number... Yeah.
In Cambodia, children venerate their parents. They're almost sacred. You don't touch them. And to see my parents dying well before they were old, in their 50s, without me being able to give back to them what they gave to me, is something that will never be erased from my life. The conditions in which they died were not worthy of animals. It's better for animals, they get buried, but my parents died in a way that there are no words to describe. Thrown into the ditch, naked. I don't even know the place where he was discarded, and I retain a terrible feeling of guilt about this. Not having been able to save my parents. If I was perhaps a little braver, I might have been able to feed them, bring them some rice, something. You never erase memories like that. And that's why I'm here, to ask this court for justice. To give the deceased back their souls so they may leave in peace. Because right now, I know their souls are lost between the living and the dead. And if there is justice, that would be an honor to them. That's why I want to come to call for justice. And not just for them, for the 2 million other Cambodians who disappeared thanks to that Khmer Rouge regime.
So, you know, there's a line in a play by William Saroyan where he said that the whole world and every human being in it is everybody's business. And obviously what he meant by that is not every single act, but certainly these worst crimes, these horrible atrocities that happen to people around the world should be everybody's business. There's a reason it's called crimes against humanity, because all of humanity needs to stand up and take a stand against it. International justice is very imperfect, but it's certainly better than doing nothing, and it can have some effect. So thank you very much for your attention. So any questions? Yes. Well, I think, you know, in many ways, the United States has already recognized the Armenian genocide. I mean, Reagan has used the word genocide. Barack Obama said that, you know, he believed it was genocide. And if you look at the statement he released, he didn't use the G word, but he said, my beliefs have not changed. You know, if you read it that way, I think it's quite clear. The fact is, of course, it was a genocide, and whether they say it or not, it's not going to change things much. But, yes. Why don't you pick the best one first? Okay, you can ask a couple. Go ahead, any other.
So I think the most outstanding one to me that I have right now is so given the fact that the courts are like international on what methodological basis and basis of moral values and law are these courts actually being run on?
Okay, so that's a very good question, especially for the law students or people interested in that. You know, every country has their own unique rules, but there are basically two major systems out there in the world. There's the common law system where trials are adversarial, where the two lawyers have the evidence and they pick the witnesses and present the arguments, and the judges or jury are neutral and decide. And then there's the civil law system, where the judges are considered responsible for finding the truth out, and they select who the witnesses are, and it's a little bit different. It's quite different in many ways. These international courts, where you bring together lawyers and judges from the different systems, have made various efforts to somewhat merge them, but slightly differently. So the Cambodian court operates under Cambodian procedural law. It has been modified in some ways, because sometimes domestic law is not practical to deal with crimes that involve millions of different incidents. The other tribunals generally operate with adversarial trials, more like the American system, that the lawyers present the evidence and the judges just are neutral arbiters and decide. But it's still evolving. You know, the rules are changed a little bit, and we're still in some ways working it out. You want to ask another one? Okay.
So I know you mentioned extermination. Okay, so other than genocide, you mentioned extermination as a definition for you know, the elimination of a group. But
so extermination, I'll explain, is a crime against humanity, and what it means is when you have to kill a massive number of individuals, and different cases. You know, there's no specific number what means massive. I think in one case in Bosnia where they took people to a house and burned it down, there were only something like 70 people, and that was found to be massive. But so that deals with it has to be a high number, and it's a crime against humanity.
Would that have a, like, for example, like political or precedent behind it, or is it just arbitrary murder? Or
yeah, it doesn't have to be for a specific political reason.
Okay,
or
so
targeting the group.
Other than genocide, then, is there a political equivalent of group extermination, I guess?
Well, I mean, you could say we have charged extermination of a political group in the Cambodian court. So people that the Khmer Rouge believe were their political enemies, we've charged that. Okay, so another question?
Okay, so this is along the same train of thought. So with charging for genocide in Cambodia, is your goal to get the definition of genocide changed so it then can include political parties? Is that kind of the aim of this? Because it seems like it doesn't necessarily fit the definition of genocide as it is right now.
No, we have not asked for them to change the definition of groups to include political groups. I mean, that was specifically debated at the time of the Genocide Convention, and a number of countries objected to including political groups. You know, many people cite the Soviet Union at the time, which, you know, obviously would have reasons not to and want to include political groups. But I think the actual evidence is a lot of different countries were afraid of including political groups. So we're not trying to change that. You know, the part of the jurisprudence that I think will change, depending on the verdict on our Cham Muslim genocide, is what it means to destroy a group as such. We say it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to kill people and wipe out their DNA. You can destroy a religious group just by saying if you don't convert, you die. So you have to have some killings in order to satisfy the actus reus. But even if many, many people survive, if they only survive because they gave up their religion, you've destroyed the group. The group doesn't exist as such. So that would change, we hope.
Yeah, got it, good. Okay. I had a couple of questions related to the atrocities in Myanmar. I was wondering if, with the given information that we have so far, you would consider the events there to be a genocide, and if you think any intervention will occur in the situation.
You know, I think it needs to be examined more whether it was a genocide. The numbers killed are not anything like Rwanda, but they're substantial numbers. And as I've said before, you know, you can kill a small part without and still be attempting to destroy the group. Generally, what they've done is force people over the border. Now, that's not genocide. The cases are pretty clear. That's not genocide. But it could be an indication of intent for genocide. So, for example, in the Srebrenica cases, some of the judgments say the fact that they took the women and children and bust them out of the municipality, while that's not an act of genocide, they say it could be reflect the intent that they didn't want the group to reconstitute itself. They wanted to spread them so that they would never be a Bosnian community in Srebrenica after that. So you can see that, you know, ethnic cleansing is generally the word that's pretty clearly used to define what happened in Myanmar, but sometimes those can overlap. I wouldn't say it's a genocide. I would say it deserves further study.
Thank you very much for this lecture. I wanted to push you a little bit, and I wanted to get your take on international justice between theory and practice. On theory, of course, it's a great ideal, something that we need to aspire to. But really in practice, and even the examples that you gave, are very much entrenched in imperial politics. So after all, international justice, those who are taken to court or have the court's decision applied to them, are supported by either our weak states or supported by an imperial forces like that of NATO. So the illegal invasion of Iraq, the horrendous occupation and what's happening in Yemen, the continuous occupation of the Palestinian territories, you know, and what's happening with Syria, because they are still also supported by yet another empire, China and Russia and so on. So really, can we think then, or in your opinion, is it then only those who are not supported by empire and weak states end up, their victims end up benefiting from international justice, while crimes that are supported by empires are unthinkable that their crimes be ever acknowledged. Thank you very much.
Well, there's no question, as I've said, the world order at the moment is that states are sovereign. And international justice requires, whatever state is involved, some sacrifice of sovereignty, either voluntary or involuntary. So in a case like the former Yugoslavia, it wasn't the former Yugoslavia that set up the court, it was the United Nations. Similar to Libya and Sudan, they didn't ask for ICC intervention, the Security Council gave it. Is the Security Council likely to investigate other crimes involving major powers? They couldn't do it probably if they wanted to for many reasons. Even this referral in Afghanistan that would include possibly the United States. Now there's, I think, very big issues about whether those cases would meet the test of gravity. Now that's one issue because the court is only supposed to be handling the most grave crimes in the world. But it's going to be impossible for them to investigate much about what happened because the United States will not cooperate with that investigation. That's the reality, but I wouldn't say that all of international justice is because of empire. People didn't refer the Khmer Rouge for trial. I don't see how the major powers benefit from that other than wanting to see the world a little bit more just. They complain about the amount of money that the court is costing. The court has, if anything, embarrassed countries like the United States because of, they go over the evidence of the bombing of Cambodia. Of course, the United States, somewhat, I think, to our shame, we supported the Khmer Rouge keeping their seat at the United Nations for years after the regime fell. If you talk about Britain as a member of the court, and the court has been looking at British acts of criminal acts in Iraq. Iraq was a member of the court, so even though Iraq is not a member of the court, but Britain is. So acts by British nationals in Iraq could be covered by the International Criminal Court. Britain has said, under the statute of the court, the court won't take cases if countries are willing and able to do it themselves. The states are sovereign first. The court will only take the case if the country's not able and willing. Britain's arguing we have investigated those cases and you don't need to take them. And so far, the court has not yet opened a formal investigation.
Has the authoritarian descent of leadership under Hun Sen in Cambodia impacted the activities of the tribunal, the Khmer Rouge tribunal in any way?
Well, you're asking me the tough questions now. Yeah, that's a matter that's undoubtedly it's had some effect on the court. The court operates in Cambodia, and it's part of the Cambodian justice system. I hope that the court, setting an example, and I do believe, has generally had a positive effect upon the Cambodian legal system. I'm not saying that the court has made the Cambodian legal system independent and fair, but it's raised the expectations. It's given an example to the population of a court that can be independent and fair. Many of the aspects of the judgment in case 2-1 I disagree with, but judges are independent. They don't follow necessarily what the prosecution says. They didn't give me everything I wanted. They may not in the next trial. So what's important, and this is true, I've also worked in other countries under pressure. In the East Timor, the government was against our indictments of Indonesian officials. What's important is, first and foremost, that we maintain our own integrity and do things for the right reasons, that we don't respond. I take an oath when I go there to take directions from no government or no individual. So I think as long as we're doing our part to set an example of being fair and independent, the effect it can have can only be positive. It doesn't mean we change the country. I wish it was true, but it's not true.
I had a couple of questions. So one, which definition of genocide do you use? Do you use the one coined by Raphael Lemkin, or do you follow the Staub model? Or?
Well, all of what's considered part of customary international law, is the definition in the Genocide Convention. So those words that I talked about. Now, there have been many cases where you talk about what those words mean. So there's a lot of jurisprudence now about defining what those words mean. But the definition comes from the 1948 Convention Against Genocide.
And then the other question was, what about forced assimilation? So you talked about religious conversion, but like in the Armenian genocide, when we weren't allowed to speak our language and weren't allowed to practice like the customs of our own culture, things like that.
But all of that can be evidence of an intent to destroy the group. Even things like destroying cemeteries so people won't go back and won't have a place to, all of that can be evidence of an intent to destroy the group.
So
but there's a difference between, what I'm arguing, I want to be clear, is not cultural genocide. If you say, for example, this group cannot speak their language or can't have schools in their language, that's not going to, normally that would not destroy the group. They would still continue to exist and identify themselves as a member of whatever ethnicity, tribe that is. That would be the crime of persecution. It could be the crime of persecution. But I'm not saying that any attempt to change culture is genocide. That's not what I'm arguing.
I was wondering if you could expand on the Sierra Leone topic that you mentioned earlier. There's something that stuck in my head with Charles Taylor being prosecuted or on trial, but you also, I thought I heard you talk about some of the people who were who opposed Charles Taylor or that regime also being on trial for some crimes.
I think what I was talking about is, in Sierra Leone, there's a tradition of people in villages being in hunter society. They're sort of like secret societies often. So as the rebels in Sierra Leone were terrorizing the countryside, some of these hunting groups formed their own militias. And often with very crude weapons, they were resisting the rebel forces. Now, they also, in several instances, carried out horrific atrocities where they wanted to punish a village because it had supported the rebels. So they went in and burned and just killed everyone in that village. So what was impressive, I think, about that court is that those people who were still very popular with the great majority of the population of Sierra Leone were themselves prosecuted.
What is your reaction to the Philippine government's decision under President Duterte last week to withdraw from the Rome Statute, especially given the current extrajudicial drug war that's occurring, being facilitated in part by Mr. Duterte, that's killed thousands of innocents?
Yeah. Well, by the terms of the court statute, anything that was done before you withdrew can still be prosecuted. In fact, you cannot withdraw, and your withdrawal is not effective until 1 year after you give formal notice to the court. But again, as I mentioned, it's very hard to prosecute without some level of cooperation. I think the Duterte regime in general, it shows a deterioration of the rule of law and the human rights situation around the world. I think, the whole world needs to stand up and condemn that. You can't have a president bragging about killing people and telling police to go out and kill anyone and they'll be protected. Thousands have been killed in that country. It's important for, especially a country like the United States, that's a very, very important friend of the Philippines, to make it clear that that's, against our policy and we do not support it.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
So thank you. You've actually laid out for us some of the sort of historical processes of expanding the definition of crimes against humanities. And as a historian, I was interested in evidence. And is there actually also a shift or actually a broadening of the category itself of what is considered to be evidential material in a court? Yeah.
I don't know if there's been a broadening. I mean, in these courts, we use various kinds of evidence, and of course, as we do it more, we learn more and more how to do it better, I would say. Of course, we depend upon witness testimony, but when you're going after high leaders, the victims of the crimes know nothing about it. You know, very few of our witnesses had ever met Khieu Samphan or Nunchea. But you look for other evidence that could be documents from the regime. Very critical is any statements you can find from the accused persons, whether they're public statements or in documents or private communications. So someone like Milimir Stakic, the mayor of Prijedor, that was a case. These cases against particularly political leaders are very difficult because you don't usually have an order, go rape this woman or go commit, torture this guy or kill these people. But what we showed is a series of orders that he had been involved in that supported the police that were carrying out the crimes, that supported the military that were carrying out the crimes. So even something like, we showed the coordination of three bodies, basically the police, the army, and the political leadership in these crimes. So something like the prisoners being taken to Amarska, they were taken by buses provided by the political leaders, by the municipality. So that was an example of how they contributed to this criminal enterprise.
I was wondering if criminal law has definition or a terminology for this variety forms of human conditions that was once considered sacred, because in archaic Roman law, sacred man, homo sacer or homo sacer, meant to be this human being who can be killed without impunity. You can kill some person or a group of people without getting any further punishment. So do we have some contemporary sort of definition or, as I said, a variety of terms for defining this human condition?
For who can be killed?
Who can be killed, without any punishment.
I would say in criminal law, there's no one that can be killed extrajudicially without punishment. I mean, there are, of course, instances where a killing is not necessarily criminal, in self-defense, for example. I mean, war crimes do not cover one soldier killing another. The crimes of war were not intended originally to stop war. They were just to regulate war so that civilians and captured soldiers cannot be killed, but a soldier with a gun, even a soldier with a gun who's sleeping, can be killed until he's disarmed or otherwise captured. So I guess the answer to your question is, while every human life has value, there are situations where killings are not necessarily illegal. I mean, if you have a valid judgment from a court, the death penalty is not yet considered a crime to carry out an execution. The Khmer Rouge, in our case, are trying to say, oh, the people, we killed them because they were threats to our national security, we were saving the country. But there was no trial, there was no evidence. And if you can play now the, I don't know, can you play the PowerPoint now, please, Rain? I had another little video of Nunchea, one of the leaders, explaining about how he has no regrets because he was protecting the nation by killing these people. But these are some of the people he killed. Most of those he killed were military-age men, but people at this school included little children. Most of the children, especially the very small ones, they didn't photograph. But these were kids were taken out and executed by being hit in the back of the neck and then having their throat slit. And a total of 16,000 people with no trial, no evidence.
Thank you for that really fascinating lecture. I have a very non-academic question. I guess it's a personal question. I was wondering, in all the years you've been working, 9 million pages of evidence or testimony. To what extent, or do we even try to compartmentalize what happens in the courtroom from the rest of your life when you go home at the end of the day? And has that changed, over your career?
It's hard to say if it's changed. I mean, I think even as a prosecutor, of course, you deal with some horrible crimes. You deal face-to-face with survivors whose family members were murdered, for example, even children murdered. But I would say, generally, I wouldn't say it has no effect on me, and you care about it. Sometimes when I hear these witnesses testifying, I get tears in my eyes, or I sometimes choke up talking about them. But I don't think it hurts me. In some ways, it makes me feel inspired to do the work. It makes me feel I hope I'm doing some good for them. It puts pressure on you that you hope you get a good result for them. You hope you don't fail them. But yeah, I mean, maybe it's not for everybody. Also, I would say that.
Can you say why there isn't a mechanism for individual citizens or a group of any aggrieved nation where there are atrocities and so forth, they don't have a mechanism, a place where they can go on their own to bring a case against the government or leader or whoever?
I mean, what can be done when there is no court? Is that what you're saying?
Why isn't there a court where individuals can go to
register
bring
a
their
complaint?
Grievance? Yes, exactly.
Well, because the international order again says that justice is a responsibility of individual states, and when the states are themselves involved in perpetrating the crime, or the states simply are not in a position because of war or whatever to prosecute, unfortunately, it falls in the cracks unless there is some international mechanism created. So your question reminds me that, for example, in Iraq and particularly in Syria now, I mentioned that there's been a refusal to refer that to the International Criminal Court. But in response, the General Assembly set up what's called the Independent and Impartial Investigative Mechanism, which is a UN body that's now being created just to collect all the evidence of crimes that occurred in the hope that one day there'll be a court, either in Syria or in the region, or even if no court's created, that perhaps one of the perpetrators is traveling through a country that will arrest him and there'll be a case against them. So there are some of these mechanisms. For North Korea, there's a big effort to collect evidence in the hope that someday those who are perpetrating these crimes in North Korea will be brought to justice. And for a minimum, even if that doesn't occur, at least the history of the crimes will have been established.
One last question, and then we need to let Nick go.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm just going off of that question quickly.
Catherine wants to watch the basketball game. I know.
Going off of that question, I was wondering if in the years that you've been working, you've seen any sort of shift away from a state-based system, or would you say that it's the same as it has been?
I would even say in the last few years there's been a retreat. I don't think we're moving really forward. Unfortunately, the progress has probably been a little bit backwards in the last few years. I don't give up hope. I still think it's a complicated situation. There's undoubtedly the questions about not every country will face justice. That's true. It's not all fair. Powerful countries can exempt themselves from the process, but the process is worth it. It's better. I think better than nothing. Okay, thank you. Thanks.